Before death was ever associated with the fates, there was order. The three Moirai. That was Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. They were not figures of dread in their earliest form. They were architects, women of ageless authority who stood at the center of how the Greeks understood existence itself. They did not preside over endings. They maintained a structure, a living geometry that held the cosmos together the way tension holds a loom upright. And you know that shift from architects to harbingers is exactly what this series is about. Make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell because we're tracing how one of history's most misunderstood images went from something almost mathematical to something almost monstrous. The thread they worked with was never random. Clotho spun it, Lachesis measured it, and each action carried the weight of arithmetic rather than cruelty. The Greeks conceived of a universe that ran on proportion and reason, and the Moirai were the physical expression of that belief. A life was a length, a destiny was a measurement. There was something almost comforting in that framework, the idea that existence followed rules precise enough to be woven. What makes the early artistic record so striking is how it positioned these women relative to the gods. On archaic pottery and in early sculptural relief, the Moirai appear not beneath the Olympians but beside them. Zeus himself was understood to be subject to fate, and the imagery reflects that honesty. The thread the Moirai hold is not a weapon or a warning, it's a blueprint, the literal material from which the shape of all things, divine and mortal alike, was drawn. When Rome absorbed Greek mythology, it did not simply translate it, it reworked it according to its own anxieties. The Moirai became the Parcae, that is Nona, Decima, and Morta, and something in the imagery tightened. The spaciousness of the Greek framework, that sense of cosmic order being tended with care, gave way to something more administrative, more final. The Roman conception of fate was less concerned with the weaving and far more focused on the moment the thread ran out. The shears entered the picture during this period, and their arrival changed everything about how these figures were read visually. In Greek imagery, the act of cutting was present but peripheral. In Roman art and literature, it moved to the center. The shears became the defining symbol of the Parcae. They reframed the entire mythology around termination rather than creation, and around the severing of life rather than the shaping of it. That hardening in the imagery did not happen in isolation. Rome, during its imperial period, was a civilization increasingly conscious of its own fragility. Succession crisis, military overextension, plague, and political violence made mortality feel less like a natural conclusion and more like something arbitrary and imposed. The Parcae reflected that mood. They became the aesthetic face of a culture that had stopped trusting time and started fearing it. Figures who no longer tended existence but simply measured how much of it remained before the blade came down. The Black Death did not just kill people, it killed an entire visual vocabulary. When the plague moved through Europe in the 14th century, it dismantled whatever remained of the classical aesthetic that had carried the fates through centuries of Roman and early Christian art. The figures that emerged on the other side of that catastrophe were unrecognizable. The dignified women at the loom had been swallowed whole by something rawer, something shaped entirely by mass death and the theology of suffering that rose up around it. The shroud replaced the thread as the dominant textile in how the fates were imagined and depicted. This was not a subtle shift in iconography. It was a complete inversion of meaning, where silk and spun fiber had once represented the texture of life being actively made. Coarse burial cloth represented life already for feet. The feet stopped looking like weavers and started looking like the dead themselves, hollowed-faced, skeletal, and draped in the same material they wrapped around their victims. The imagery collapsed the distance between the one who ends life and the state of having ended. They became indistinguishable from the thing they caused. What the medieval period erased most completely was the individuality. Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos had each carried a distinct role and a distinct presence. That specificity dissolved. In the woodcuts, frescoes, and manuscript illustrations produced during and after the plague years, the three figures increasingly merged into one composite image, a single skeletal inevitability, hooded and anonymous. The careful Greek logic of three women with three functions gave way to something that had no interest in function at all. There was only the figure. There was only the end. The late Renaissance painters did not need to reinvent the fates. They simply stopped illuminating them. Chiaroscuro, that technique of drowning form in shadow while pulling certain surfaces into brutal light, became the primary tool through which artists like Michelangelo's Circle and later Baroque adjacent masters repositioned these figures within the visual world. The divine radiance that classical art had extended to the Moirai was withdrawn deliberately. They were pushed into the dark corners of the canvas, partially consumed by blackness, rendered as things that existed at the edge of what could be looked at directly. The darkness was not atmospheric. It was a theological and psychological statement about where power over human life now belonged, which was out of reach, out of sight, and deeply threatening. The bodies changed too. Late Renaissance depictions leaned into age with a specificity that felt almost punishing. Sunken cheeks, knotted hands, carved spines, and eyes set deep into faces that looked excavated rather than sculpted. This was not incidental or purely aesthetic. The period was gripped by a fierce aristocratic anxiety about aging, about the body's betrayal of status, beauty, and control. The fits absorbed that anxiety and wore it visibly. They became the physical argument that time degrades, that the flesh cannot be negotiated with, and that no amount of wealth or patronage changes the condition of the body moving toward its end. The spindle completed its transformation during this period. In the hands of these withered, shadow-buried figures, it no longer read as an instrument of craft. The elite patrons commissioning this work lived inside systems of political fragility, which ranged from shifting papal allegiances, dynastic instability, and the creeping sense that power could be revoked without warning. A tool held by a figure associated with irreversible fate, depicted in hands of something ancient and deformed and half hidden, stopped looking like a loom accessory and started looking like an implement of sentence. The spindle became the object in the hand of the thing that had already decided, and no one in the painting was going to stop it. Thank you for watching. Until the next one.